Hello, everybody. It is a great pleasure to have a dialogue with Paul Morland, the author of the book, The Human Tide, translated into Romanian language at Trei publishing house. Hello, Mr. Morland, and thank you for joining us.
Hello.
For the beginning, let me ask you, what is the human tide? Not the book, but the concept.
The concept is that until about 1800, human beings were born and died in varying numbers. Their numbers went up, their numbers went down, there were plagues, there were good times, there were years of good harvests in which populations grew, then they were knocked back by maybe a plague or a war. There's no really strong pattern before about 1800. Some demographers would dispute that, some would put the date a bit earlier. But to say it's a random walk before about 1800 is perhaps an exaggeration. There is growth, but in almost 2,000 years, the population quadruples of the world, which is not actually that much over such a long time. And then in about 1800, between 1750 and 1800, first of all in the British Isles, northwestern Europe, then spreading to the rest of Europe and then to the rest of the world, there is this pattern that emerges in stages. And the first stage is, and again, there are technicalities which I won't go into now, but broadly, as living standards rise, as people get more educated and more urbanized, they tend to have a fall in the death rate. They're better at looking after themselves, medical facilities improve. Sometimes it can be quite small things that make a very big difference. And so their numbers accumulate. And then eventually their fertility falls, urbanized, educated women have smaller children, and eventually the population stabilizes. So first of all, it was small, then it grew very rapidly, and then at a larger stage, it flattens off. And what happens after that is another story, and that's the story of my next book, actually, which is coming out in March, which is called Tomorrow's People, which is really what are the big trends today, and where do we go after that big demographic transition? But the idea of the tide is it starts in Northern Europe, it goes global, and the point of all of that is not that just the demography, but what is the effect of all of that? How does that then feed into global history? How does it drive some economies up and others down? How does it make some powers great and other powers diminish? The pure weight of human numbers, which shifts around the world over time, I think has a very big impact on world history. And The Human Tide as a book is really the first attempt, I think, to crystallize that in one place. That's not to say these various issues haven't been looked at before in other places, but it's an attempt to tell the history of the last 200 years as if demography really mattered, which I think it does.
Mm-hmm. Let's be a little bit more analytic. Can we reduce human history to numbers, to demographic? And on the other hand, is demography the key of understanding history and understanding the world today?
I think if I tried to create a formula which explained all of human history, I'd either be a genius or mad, and almost certainly mad, not a genius. Certainly human history does not work like physics. I certainly don't think we can put a formula on human history. Equally, I think it's an interesting phenomenon. I think a lot about this, why people like simple, parsimonious explanations. And in physics, we know that they're trying to develop a theory of everything. And wouldn't it be nice if history could be explained by one thing? And in a way, I think it goes back to monotheism. I think it goes back to the belief in one God, the emergence of monotheism out of polytheism or different religious practices. The idea that one God can explain everything, has created everything. That's a theological question I'm obviously not going to go into. But I think building science and social science in a monotheistic culture, there is this tendency for people to want a very simple explanation. And the more simple the explanation, in some ways, the better. But I think it would be, from my very modest position, I think it would, not as a scientist, I think it would be very hubristic, very vain, to claim that demography can explain all of human history. Of course it can't. What I'm trying to claim in the book is that it is one of many perspectives. You cannot explain everything through economics. You cannot explain everything through the personalities of individuals. You can't explain everything through technological change. And anyway, all of these things interrelate. But I think demography does play a big role, and it is a big explanatory role, and it's a role that's missing in many histories, or underplayed in many histories. So I'm trying to make the case that it is a big player in the explanatory field, not that it explains everything. And the way I try and do this is to talk about necessity and sufficiency. So having a big population is not a sufficient condition for having a big economy or being a big power. We know that China in the 19th century, as at any time in history, and will continue to be for a few years, but not very much longer, had the biggest population in the world. In the 19th and early 20th century, China had very little power. China was really prone to the forces of Europe and Japan, more dynamic societies. So just having numbers doesn't make you a powerful country or indeed a big economy. But my point is, so demography is not a sufficient explanatory force. But without the big population, you can only get so far. So I'm claiming it is a necessary force. So, for example, if we take the United States, imagine that the United States, for whatever reason, had never got above the sort of population that the UK or Germany or France had. You know, let's say mid-century, 40, 50, 60 million, maybe 70, 80, 90 million today. It would undoubtedly have been a very important player. It would have controlled a big territory. If indeed with that population it had managed to go coast to coast, it would have controlled a lot of resources. But the reason that it really dominated, let's say in 1950, yes, it had a higher per capita GDP than the European countries, but it had many, many more people. Its population took off. And kind of left the middle-sized European powers behind, as did Russia's, indeed, at the end of the 19th century. And interestingly, de Tocqueville, when he went to America in the early mid-19th century, can't remember whether it was the 1830s or 40s, but anyway, he said Russia and America will be able to house vast populations and they will dominate the world in the 20th century. So my point is, by having big population, those two countries were not inevitably going to be the late 20th century superpowers. But if you don't have those big populations and those population forces, you're never going to have a massive economy, and you're never going to be able to field a very large army. And so you might be important, but you're not going to be top dog. And similarly, to give another example, Luxembourg's a very wealthy country, very well educated, wealthy people, successful, efficient, productive. But, they don't play a role in the world because there are only a few 100,000 of them.
Mm-hmm. One more question in the same direction, analytical direction. Is the human tide a metaphor or a scientific tool? And what is the scientific importance of this formula? How accurate is it?
Well, I made a joke actually when my book was published that it was being sold in Waterstones, which is one of the leading bookshops in book chains in the UK, under Popular Science. And I made the joke at my book launch that my children actually made the joke that although my book was in Popular Science, I wasn't either popular or a scientist. So I really think of it as a work of history. I don't think of it as a work of science. I don't think of it as a formula. Then you have the more philosophical question: how scientific is history? Is history a science? There's a very famous book in the UK. It's quite an old book now by E.H. Carr called "What is History?" When I was in my teens, everyone who wanted to go to a good university to read history or something similar read this book. And it argues that history is a science. I think this is a terminological question. It hinges somewhat on a difference between an Anglo-Saxon and a continental European understanding of what science is. I don't have a great, deep philosophy of history as a science that I wish to push. I'm simply saying that population matters if we want to understand the past.
Mm-hmm. Is the human tide rising or is falling now? or does it depend on the perspective from which we look at this topic?
I think it depends on the perspective that you look at it. I suppose there are two parts of that answer. The answer, one is it's rising and falling relatively in different places. So we know that in Europe, fertility rates are very low. Populations are either falling or would be falling without immigration. Countries like Germany, without immigration, would have a falling population. Most of Southern and Eastern Europe has a very low fertility rate, including Romania, against which the fertility rate in the Middle East is falling, is not that high, but there's a lot of population momentum from previous years of high fertilities. A lot of population swell in the Middle East. And the place that's really motoring is Sub-Saharan Africa, where women are still having, in many places, 6 or 7 children. It's fallen in certain countries. South Africa, it's well below that. Kenya, Ethiopia, it's falling. But much of West Africa and Uganda, still very, very high. So that's where it's kind of supercharged. If you look at the consequences of that, I think are very interesting and not inevitable, but I think there will be consequences. If you look globally, what's happening, I think if you stand back, what you see is the following. The world population grows pretty gradually, so it quadruples over, as I said, the best part of 2,000 years, and it gets up from perhaps 250 million to 1 billion between, as I say in the book, Julius Caesar and Queen Victoria. For British people, because Julius Caesar conquered Britain and Queen Victoria was our longest reigning monarch until the current Queen, those are kind of points that they can associate with. So it quadruples over a very long period of time, and then it goes up 7 or 8 times in a couple of 100 years. So in a fraction of that 2,000 years, in 200 years, instead of going up 4 times, it goes up 8 times. So we're in this incredible expansion. But since the 1960s and 70s, it's having gone into this extraordinary uptick, it's now slowing down. And whereas it was growing 2%, global population was growing 2% a year, every year in the late 60s and early 70s, that's gone down to 1% a year. Now, exponentially, that makes a huge difference of 1% versus a 2% growth per annum. And then by the end of this century, and some people would say by the middle of this century, but sometime between 2050 and 2100, it will probably flatten off entirely. We can't know for sure. A lot depends on what happens with how quickly sub-Saharan African fertility rates fall. But broadly, this extraordinary, unprecedented historical growth that picked up pace from about 1800 and was really motoring very, very fast globally in the middle towards the end of the 20th century, this is rapidly falling off now. And we will be back to a stable population sometime in the next 50 to 70 years.
Mm-hmm. If we call it tide, it means that also that it can break. What can break a human tide? I mean, something objective or predictable, or on the other hand, something like let's say a black swan.
Well, if we're talking about, if by the human tide we mean population growth and the size of population, so let's divide your question, your 2 questions, so I'll give 2 answers, the predictable and the unpredictable, the black swan. So the predictable is, of course, the following fact. We had very high fertility in most societies over time and very high mortality. Lots were born, lots died, and then the death rate falls, better healthcare, and until the fertility rate falls, you've got massive population growth. And that's what's happening now in sub-Saharan Africa. But elsewhere in the world, fertility rates have fallen in many, many places to below long-term replacement level. Almost everywhere in Europe, in North America, in East Asia, and it's catching. So more and more countries are falling into that below replacement level. So what will break the human tide globally is when sub-Saharan Africa eventually gets to sub-replacement level or replacement level, and then after many decades, because you've still got what we call demographic momentum, many decades after sub-Saharan African women start having 2 children on average or fewer, then the population will stabilize in sub-Saharan Africa and globally. So it could be I mean, you might predict, it's not definite, that globally, what we would call the modern lifestyle, the urban lifestyle, the educated working woman, the values of modern liberal societies are inevitably linked with low fertility. And in fact, not necessarily liberal societies. It's low fertility in China. Even as they get rid of their restrictions, people don't want larger families. If you look at Chinese communities in Malaysia, in Taiwan, if you look at Japan, lots of places that didn't have the one-child policy, fertility rates have fallen very, very low. So it's not just a Western phenomenon, it's not just a liberal phenomenon. So there's something about modernity that is inevitably associated with low fertility rates. And that is what one could predict will break the human tide. Let's come back to that in a minute. The black swans are obviously, and we're very aware of pandemics today. Now, the last figures I've seen is that perhaps 15 million people have been killed by coronavirus. Many of them would have died within a fairly short period of time. It's been nothing like the extent of the Spanish flu. More people died. There were fewer people on the planet. They tended to be young. So the lost years of life was much greater. So at this stage, coronavirus almost certainly won't be on anything like the global scale of the Spanish flu of 100 years ago. But who knows? Pandemics may arise. They may arise naturally. They may arise out of laboratories. And so that could certainly be a kind of black swan event, which could knock fertility, knock human numbers much more rapidly through not just slowing down the fertility rate, but increasing the death rate and knocking total population figures. So just coming back to the first thing, I'm not convinced that it's inevitable that as you get towards modernity, you will have low fertility rates. So globally, that seems to be the case. As I said, it's in many, many different societies, Puerto Rico, Taiwan, Singapore. I mean, many, many different countries, even countries that are not necessarily that rich, sometimes get to quite low fertility rates. Thailand would be a good example of that. Well below replacement, but still a relatively low income country, or low middle at best. But within certain countries and communities, you see a high fertility rate that seems to persist. So the Mormons in America, the Hutterites, Haredi Jews in America, in the UK and elsewhere, very often seem to be able to have larger families. The Mormons somewhat less so. The Haredim perhaps have 6 or 7. If you're having 6 or 7 children on average in a modern society with healthcare, with very low infant mortality, your population can double in 15, 20 years. And so what are currently quite small communities, it's rather like the famous lake that overflows. You know, it doubles, then it doubles, and it doubles. And until the last few doublings, you barely notice it. But once it gets to a certain size, if it keeps its growth rate up, then you really notice it. And that's one phenomenon. So religious communities. The other case which is very interesting is Israel, where by every standard, modernity is very high, by the standards of women's education, by the standards of general university education, by the standards of GDP per capita. And yet in Israel, the fertility rate is 3 children per woman. There's no other OECD country that is above 2. I think Ireland's probably just below 2. Everything's a bit disrupted at the moment because of COVID. But Israel stands head and shoulders above any other developed country. Now, why that is itself an interesting and complex question. But I think it proves that with modernity, science, education, urbanization, you do not necessarily have to get a low fertility rate.
Mm-hmm. Does the democratic revolution change the cultural relation? Actually, is the demographic revolution a crisis, or is something about normality in this sense?
I think it is a crisis, because I think it's very interesting. In the UK in the last few weeks, we had a terrible petrol shortage. There was plenty of petrol, but there were no drivers for the petrol tankers, and people were queuing outside petrol stations. This is more or less gone now. There's a general shortage in our supermarkets, not crisis level, but all sorts of things in the UK, and I think in other countries we're short of them that we weren't used to. And this is to do partly with Brexit here, it's partly to do with COVID and post-COVID disruption, but it's also to do with the shortage of workers in certain areas. Now, when you broaden it out, again, I'm talking about the UK, we are short of midwives, although we're not having that many children. We're short of doctors, we're short of nurses. We are in a society where we've had unemployment as a problem. It's become much less of a problem, but very much in the mind of the population, unemployment is the problem. And our politicians always talk about jobs, jobs, jobs. But I think we may well be entering a period when in the UK, and again, I suspect this is common, we're just short of workers, and the technology is not there yet to pick up the slack. Now, why are we short of workers? I wrote an article for a British newspaper a couple of weeks ago, and I was arguing in it that when I started work in the 1980s, for every person in their early 20s, or for every person in their early 60s, rather, who was going to retire, there were 2 people in their early 20s coming into the workforce. Now, you can play around with this. You can make people retire later. You can get people into the workforce a bit earlier. But basically, there was that 2-to-1 ratio of youngsters coming into the workforce and people in their late middle age leaving the workforce. And we got used to that inflow. And that's because in the 50s and 60s, we had a high fertility rate and we got plenty of young people. 1970s and 80s, much lower fertility rate. So that starts feeding through. And we have a huge immigration, and we mass import people to make up for this. And for all sorts of reasons, we maybe don't want to carry on doing that anymore. Brexit was very largely about controlling our own immigration. So, and not every country can have a mass inflow of people. Some countries have to have an outflow of people. I don't know the Romanian data, but I know in Bulgaria a lot of people have left. And certainly, anecdotally, we have many Romanians in the UK. So I assume in Romania, likewise, you're starting to feel the fact that I know you had this peculiar blip in the 60s with Ceausescu and his efforts to boost the fertility rate, and that probably has a feed-through effect. But sooner or later, if not already, you will have a shortage of young people coming into the workforce compared to those leaving it. Now, the trouble with all of that is we like things to be done. We want petrol in the petrol station when we get there. We want food on the shelves in the supermarket. We want a nurse in the hospital when our mum needs an operation, or someone in the care home to look after her. We expect all these things to happen. In the UK anyway, we have very, very high expectation. We don't even think about. We're rather like spoiled children, if you like. And suddenly we will find a shortage of people doing many jobs. And as I say, eventually technology may well take up much of the slack. But in the meanwhile, I think we are going to be short of labour.
Mm-hmm. What are the colors of the future related with the human tide? You said something.
So this is what I say at the end. It's a sort of snappy end, but something I will come back to in the next book and the book afterwards. I say less white, more grey, and more green. So less white is what I was talking about earlier. The first people to go through the demographic transition were the people in the British Isles, and then it spread to Europe, elsewhere in North America. So all throughout the world of North America and Europe, we have had a long period now of low fertility rate, and there will eventually be fewer of us. In fact, the total number of people who are described as white in the US is already falling. As I said, in Germany, the population would be falling without immigration. Meanwhile, that's now also happening in Asia, as we know. It's in East Asia. It's starting to happen in India, although, again, it will be a long time before that feeds through into lower numbers of people. So, meanwhile, the population of Sub-Saharan Africa is exploding. So the world will be much less white. I mean, if you go back to the 19th century, we take it for granted. But if you think about it, say about 1800, there weren't British people or Anglo-Saxons or English-speaking people living in California or Australia. This was the result of this massive population explosion in the British Isles ahead of other people in the 19th century. So by the end of the 19th century, you had Anglo communities from the west coast of the United States to the furthest reaches of Australia. So our history in some way has been the vast expansion of peoples of European origin. That is now going into reverse. So it will be a less white world. I say a greyer world. We say grey as a sort of analogy to old in English. I don't know if that works in Romanian. But we'll just be older, and it won't just be European societies that will be older. China, Japan is already quite an old society. The median age, the age of the middle person, if you lined up the whole population by age, what's the age of the middle person? You can track that over time. And there are plenty of countries in Europe now, Italy is a good example, Germany, where it's heading for the mid-40s. And it will be heading for the 50s, and not just in Europe. So the whole of the Mediterranean littoral, places like Libya by 2100, which has quite a low fertility rate now, will have quite old populations. And that has all sorts of effects on pensions, on welfare, on elder care, and so on. So that's the kind of more grey. I think the more green, the argument of more green, is not that necessarily we will have no environmental problems, and of course there's global warming and so on, but essentially, as people reduce in number, meanwhile they continue to urbanize. So even a country like France, which is more or less has a stable population, because it's not growing and because people continue to go to the big cities, you have large areas, and I imagine it's the same in Romania, where you have less agriculture than you had 50 or 100 years ago. Terraces have been abandoned, some villages have been abandoned, and nature returns. Nature fills the vacuum, the same in, I think I give examples in the book, in Japan as well. I spent a lot of time in southern France, in the department of the Pyrénées-Orientales. Bear and wolf have been spotted in these in the Pyrénées-Orientales, which weren't there 30 or 40 years ago. So as the great population explosion reverses itself globally, I think there's more space for the environment to move back.
Mm-hmm. Two more questions. Can we see clear in the future what will happen to the human tide, or can we only hope at most? Actually, should we fear? Should we afraid the science and the future are the risky?
I'm not going to talk about sort of general scientific risk. I'm not a futurist. And I'm not a scientist. I don't, for example, if you said to me, are we going to have nuclear wars? Are we going to have biological outbreaks that wipe out the population? I could give you my view as a layman, but I don't have any special insight into that. But I do think we should be a bit more optimistic about our future, a bit less fearful, if only because that will encourage us to have more children. So I do think it's a problem in much of the world. We're having too few children. That is a worry. And I think people should have a bit more confidence in the future and be a bit more pro-natal.
Mm-hmm. And the last one, the human tide, your story, your history, is a history about hope, or its opposite? It's a history with plus or with a minus?
Well, it's pluses and minuses, but on balance, I would say pluses. So I think I'm quite pleased I was born. I don't know about you. And I imagine a lot of the people who are watching this were pleased they were born. And therefore, for them to be born, their parents and their grandparents had to be born, and they had to have a certain amount of medical care, they had to have a certain amount of food. Before modern times, however defined, about 1 in 3 children died before the age of 1. So imagine that. I mean, you only had a 66% chance of making it to your first birthday. So we have reversed that. Now in the UK, well, in the best countries, it's perhaps 3 in 1,000 or even 2 in 1,000. In fact, Romania, I think, has been very successful at lowering infant mortality. A lot of European countries have been. Britain's perhaps 5 in 1,000. I mean, it's tiny, tiny, tiny compared to what was 300 to 400 in 1,000 dying in their first year. So we've managed to make life much better for many, many people. Yes, there are environmental challenges, but the fact that there are so many human lives with so much potential for enjoyment, for culture, for pleasure, for travel, for intellectual stimulation, for friendship, and all the wonderful things that can go with being alive, I think is overall an optimistic story.
Paul Morland, it was an extraordinary conversation. Thank you very much for being in dialogue together. Thank you very much for your amazing book. I'm a great fan of it, and thank you very much for all of this.
Thank you for your question. Bye-bye.